The study smelled like cedar and cold coffee, and Vivian Mercer stood in the middle of it with her arms crossed, refusing to let her voice shake. "Say it again," she said. "Tell me where you were tonight." Barrett Calloway didn't look up from the papers on his desk. "A meeting. You know how this works." "On Christmas Eve? At 11 at night?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. 3 months, Barrett. 3 months of you disappearing after dinner and coming back smelling like someone else's perfume. I'm not stupid. He finally lifted his eyes to hers, and for a second something flickered there. Guilt, maybe, or exhaustion. He didn't explain. He never explained anymore. That silence had become its own kind of answer, and Vivian was tired of translating it. "Fine," she said quietly. "Go spend Christmas with your mistress. I hope she makes you happier than I ever could." She pulled the ring from her finger and set it on the edge of his desk, the small click of metal against wood louder than anything either of them had said all night. Then she walked out, and Barrett let her go, because some old, tired part of him assumed she'd cool off in the guest wing like she always did. He poured himself a drink instead of following her. That was his first mistake. By 1 in the morning, when he finally climbed the stairs to check on her, the guest room was empty. The bed hadn't been touched. Her phone sat charging on the nightstand, screen dark. Her coat still hung by the door downstairs. Nothing was missing, except her. Barrett stood in that empty room for a long moment, telling himself there was a simple explanation. She'd gone to her sister's. She'd taken a walk to clear her head. Any second now he'd hear her key in the lock, but the seconds kept passing, and the house kept staying silent. And something cold started climbing up the back of his neck. He called his head of security at 1:40 a.m. By 3, 6 men were sweeping the estate grounds with flashlights, checking every gate, every camera angle, every inch of the 8-foot wall that surrounded the property. Vivian's car sat untouched in the garage. Her wallet, her credit cards, her passport, all exactly where she'd left them. A woman with nothing in her pockets had walked out of one of the most heavily guarded homes in Chicago, and no one had seen her leave. "That's not possible," Barrett said, standing in the security office as the night shift supervisor pulled up hours of footage. Someone had to see something. But the cameras told a strange story. At 12:47 a.m., every feed covering the west perimeter went dark for exactly 90 seconds. Not static, not a glitch, a clean, deliberate shutdown, the kind that required an access code most of his own men didn't have. When the feeds came back online, the gate sensor showed it had been opened and closed once. After that, nothing. No car left the property, no taxi had been called. It was as if she'd walked straight through the wall. Barrett felt his jaw tighten. 90 seconds. Someone had planned that gap down to the second. "Pull every log from the internal system," he told his tech specialist, a sharp young man named Dorian, who'd been with the family for 6 years. "I want to know exactly what was touched tonight." Dorian worked in silence for nearly 20 minutes, his fingers moving fast across the keyboard, his expression shifting from focused to uneasy. Finally, he turned the monitor toward Barrett. "Sir, I don't understand this," he said. "The command that killed the West cameras came from an administrative override, top-level clearance. There are only 2 people in the world with that access code." "Me," Barrett said slowly. "And who else?" Dorian hesitated before answering. "Your wife, sir. It's tied to her credentials, but she's never used it, not once in 3 years." Barrett stared at the screen, at the timestamp, at the quiet proof that Vivian hadn't stumbled out into the night in a fit of heartbreak. She had planned this. She had known exactly which cameras to kill and exactly how long to leave the gap open. A woman who supposedly spent her days managing charity dinners and reading in the garden had just outmaneuvered a security system built by men who used to work for federal agencies. He sat down slowly in the chair across from Dorian, his mind racing back over the last 3 years, every time Vivian had asked oddly specific questions about his shipping routes. Every late evening she claimed to spend at her sister's, every notebook she kept locked in a drawer he'd never bothered to open because he trusted her completely. Check her financial activity, Barrett said. Everything. Every account, every transfer, going back as far as the system allows. Dorian's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Sir, that could take hours. Then we start now. Barrett stood, straightened his jacket, and looked out the window at the dark, quiet estate grounds, where somewhere beyond the wall, his wife had vanished into the night, with a skill that no one had ever taught her. Whatever Vivian Mercer had been building in the shadows of their marriage, it wasn't a secret romance. It was something far bigger, and Barrett had a sick feeling he was only seeing the first piece of it. By noon, Barrett hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, and hadn't said more than a dozen words to anyone. He sat at the head of a long steel table in the command center, 12 floors above the city, while his top lieutenants filed in one by one, unsure why they'd been summoned on Christmas Day. My wife is missing, Barrett said, before anyone could ask. The room went still. As of last night, she is no longer at the estate. I want every man we have working this, quietly. No police, no outside calls. This does not leave this building. Marcus Doyle, his second in command for nearly a decade, leaned forward. Ransom? A rival move? I don't think so. Barrett's jaw tightened. The cameras were shut down using her own access codes. She let herself out. That landed hard. A few of the men exchanged glances, the unspoken question passing between them. Why would a woman who had everything walk away from it on her own? And do it so cleanly that a team of trained professionals hadn't caught a single frame of her leaving. Start with transit, Barrett said. Trains, private car services, anything moving out of the city since midnight. Check every safe house we know of, even the ones we haven't used in years. If she's hiding, she picked a place she knew wouldn't be watched. The lieutenants split into teams, phones already pressed to their ears before they'd cleared the doorway. Barrett stayed behind with Dorian, who had been quietly working through the night, eyes red-rimmed from staring at screens. Tell me you found something, Barrett said. Dorian turned his laptop around. I found a lot of something, sir, and none of it makes sense yet. He pulled up a folder of transaction logs, dense with dates and figures. 3 hours before she left, your wife accessed the internal network. Not just the cameras. She went into the financial servers, the ones tied to your legitimate shipping fronts, and she wiped her digital trail. Deleted access logs, rerouted her login history through 3 dummy accounts, and then closed the loop so cleanly that if I hadn't been specifically looking for it, I never would have noticed. Barrett leaned over the screen, scanning the lines of code. That takes real skill. Vivian doesn't have that kind of training. That's what I thought too, Dorian said. But look at the timestamps. Whoever did this wasn't rushing. It's methodical, patient. This isn't someone panicking and covering their tracks last minute. This is someone who's been planning an exit for a long time. The words settled into Barrett's chest like a stone. He thought back over the years, small things he'd dismissed without a second thought. Vivian asking about a shipment delay in Milwaukee, casually, over dinner. Vivian excusing herself from galas early, claiming a headache, only to come home smelling faintly of diesel and cold air instead of cigarette smoke and perfume, like he'd assumed. He'd built a mental story around every one of those moments, and every story he'd told himself had been wrong. Where did the money go? Barrett asked. If she was moving funds, there has to be a trail somewhere. Dorian pulled up another screen, this one filled with routing numbers and transfer records stretching back years. This is the strange part. It's not going into a personal account. It's going into holding companies, dozens of them, spread across 4 states, all funneling back to something called Meridian Point Partners. The deposits are small enough each time that nobody flagged them, but added up over 3 years, we're talking about tens of millions. Tens of millions, Barrett repeated flatly. Coming from where? That's what doesn't add up. Dorian scrolled further. A chunk of it traces back to trade routes you thought were dead. Remember the Midwest freight contracts we lost 2 years ago? The ones you told the board had dried up because of market shifts? Barrett remembered. He'd taken the loss on the chin, absorbed it as bad luck, one of the few setbacks in an otherwise growing operation. He'd never questioned it further because there hadn't seemed to be a reason to. They didn't dry up, Dorian said quietly. They were redirected. Somebody rerouted those contracts into a separate pipeline years ago, and it's been running underneath your operation ever since, quiet and untouched. Barrett sat back, feeling the floor of his certainty shift beneath him. Someone had been siphoning off pieces of his empire for 3 years, dressing the losses up as bad timing and bad markets, and he had believed every word of it because he'd had no reason to look closer. Now his wife had vanished the same night that trail led straight back to her fingerprints. "Find out who controls Meridian Point Partners," Barrett said. "I want a name by tonight." "I'm already digging," Dorian said. "But sir, whoever set this up knew exactly how to stay invisible. Shell companies inside shell companies. This wasn't built by someone learning as they went. This was built by someone who understood your entire operation better than most of the men in this building." Barrett stood and walked to the window, looking out over the grey Chicago skyline, the ache in his chest now tangled with something else, something that felt uncomfortably close to admiration, even as the anger simmered beneath it. He had spent 3 months assuming his wife was hiding an affair. Instead, it looked like she'd been hiding an empire. And somewhere out there, on the coldest Christmas day of his life, Vivian Mercer wasn't running from him. She was 3 steps ahead of him, and he was only now starting to realize the game had never been the one he thought he was playing. The lead came in at dawn, a single financial ping that Dorian had managed to isolate from thousands of dead ends. A transaction, routed through Meridian Point Partners, had touched a private wealth management firm in Milwaukee less than 6 hours earlier. It was thin, barely a thread, but it was the first thing that had moved since Vivian disappeared, and Barrett was on the road before the sun had fully cleared the buildings behind him. He drove himself, no driver, no escort trailing behind, because whatever this was, he wanted to see it with his own eyes, before anyone else's version of the story reached him first. 90 minutes later, he was standing outside a quiet stone building in Milwaukee's financial district, the kind of place that didn't advertise itself, tucked between older buildings with brass nameplates and no signage explaining what happened inside. He expected, if he was honest with himself, to walk in and find Vivian. Some part of him had been rehearsing it the whole drive, what he'd say, how he'd stay calm, how he wouldn't raise his voice even though every nerve in his body was strung tight. Instead, a receptionist led him to a small conference room where a man in his 50s was already waiting, a leather folder resting on the table in front of him. "Mr. Calloway," the man said, standing to shake his hand. "I'm Nathaniel Price. I handle corporate filings for several clients in this building. I was told you'd be coming." Barrett's stomach tightened. "Told by who?" "That's not something I'm able to share," Price said carefully, "but I was instructed to give you this if you showed up asking questions." He slid the folder across the table. "I'd recommend sitting down before you open it." Barrett didn't sit. He opened the folder standing, and the first page inside was a registered corporate deed, dense with legal language, dated 3 years earlier. His eyes moved down the page until they landed on a section outlining commercial property acquisitions, and his stomach dropped further with every line he read. "This says a holding company has been buying industrial real estate across the Midwest for 3 years, Barrett said slowly. "Warehouses, distribution centers, rail access points." He looked up. "Whose company is this?" "The ownership structure is layered," Price said. "Several shell entities feeding into one parent company. But the funding source is very clear, and it's the part I was told to make sure you saw." He tapped a highlighted line near the bottom of the page. Barrett read it twice before the words made sense. The acquisitions had been funded entirely through legitimate trade dividends, profits from freight contracts his own syndicate had supposedly lost 2 years ago. The same contracts Dorian had flagged the night before. Someone hadn't just diverted the money. They had taken the losses Barrett wrote off as bad luck and quietly turned them into an entirely separate, fully legal commercial empire, one property at a time, right under his nose. "This is worth millions," Barrett said. "Closer to 60, Price said, conservatively. "Some of these warehouses have tripled in value since acquisition." Whoever built this understood commercial real estate cycles better than most professionals I've worked with in 30 years. Barrett flipped further into the folder and found a section labeled Operational Oversight, and beneath it, a single name he didn't recognize: Mercer Logistics. He stared at the surname. Mercer. Vivian's maiden name, the one she'd quietly kept tucked into a hyphen most people forgot was there, the one she'd told him once, years ago, she liked because it felt like something that belonged only to her. "Who is Mercer Logistics?" Barrett asked, though a cold certainty was already settling into his chest. "I can't speak to internal operations," Price said. "I only handle the property filings, but I was told you'd recognize the name once you saw it." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Mr. Calloway, I've filed papers for a great many clients over the years. Most of them inherited their wealth or built it through the kind of business that requires men like you at the table. This is different. Whoever assembled this portfolio did it methodically, legally, without a single filing error in 3 years. I don't say that lightly. It's rare." Barrett closed the folder, his hands steady even though nothing inside him felt steady at all. 3 years. She had been doing this for 3 years, moving in the spaces he never thought to look, turning what he believed were failures into the foundation of something enormous. And she'd done it so quietly that even his own financial team, men he paid very well to catch exactly this kind of thing, had never noticed. "I need everything you have on Mercer Logistics," Barrett said. "Every filing, every location, every contact tied to it." Price hesitated. "I can give you the public filings. Beyond that, I'd be breaking confidentiality I was specifically asked to maintain." "Asked by my wife." "I never said that name," Price replied evenly, but something in his expression confirmed it well enough. Barrett took the folder and walked out without another word, standing on the sidewalk outside the building as the cold morning air hit his face. He thought about the ring sitting on his desk, about the empty guest room, about 90 seconds of dead camera footage that had felt like a personal betrayal 12 hours ago. It didn't feel like betrayal anymore. It felt like something far more unsettling. Somewhere out there, his wife had built an operation worth tens of millions of dollars, funded by money he thought he'd lost, hidden behind a name that was quietly, entirely her own. And Barrett realized, standing on that Milwaukee sidewalk, that he had absolutely no idea who Vivian Mercer really was. The address on the last page of Price's folder led Barrett to a stretch of land he hadn't thought about in years. A rail yard on the edge of Gary, Indiana, half swallowed by fog and the orange glow of sodium lights. It had been a dead zone once, an old cargo hub his syndicate used sparingly and quietly wrote off the books years ago when newer routes made it obsolete. Standing outside the perimeter fence now, Barrett understood why nobody had questioned its silence. It hadn't been abandoned at all. Behind the fence, the yard was alive. Floodlights lit up a row of freight trucks lined in neat formation, their trailers stamped with a logo he'd never seen before, a simple compass rose beside the words Mercer Logistics. Men in dark jackets moved between the vehicles with clipboards, calling out numbers, loading crates with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from months, maybe years, of doing exactly this. It didn't look like a hideout. It looked like a fully operating shipping company running in the middle of the night, invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Barrett parked a quarter-mile off and approached on foot, staying low along the tree line until he found a gap in the fence where an old maintenance gate had been left slightly open, either by mistake or, he suspected, by design. He slipped through and kept to the shadows between 2 rows of shipping containers, watching. That was when he saw her. Not Vivian, Evelyn Thorne. Barrett's jaw tightened at the sight of her, walking briskly across the yard toward a sleek mobile command trailer parked near the loading docks, its windows glowing faintly blue with the light of monitors inside. For 3 months, Barrett's inner circle had quietly flagged Evelyn Thorne as a person of interest, a woman who moved through rival syndicate territory with unusual freedom, whose name occasionally surfaced in intelligence reports tied to a rival network out of Detroit. He'd assumed, along with everyone else, that she was the woman Vivian suspected him of seeing. It was the only story that had ever made sense. Except, Evelyn wasn't carrying a weapon. She was carrying a stack of operational ledgers, thick binders tucked under one arm, moving with the brisk, focused energy of someone managing a business, not running an underground operation. She stepped into the mobile command center and the door shut behind her, and through the narrow gap in the blinds, Barrett caught a glimpse of screens showing shipment schedules, not surveillance feeds. Route maps, not weapons inventories. He moved closer, careful to stay out of the light, and pressed himself against the container nearest the trailer, close enough now to hear muffled voices through the thin walls. "The Minneapolis numbers are ahead of projection," Evelyn was saying, her voice clipped and businesslike. "If the St. Louis contracts close this week, we'll have full coverage across 5 states by spring." A second voice answered, lower, harder to make out, but Barrett's whole body went still trying to catch it. It wasn't Vivian's voice. A man, he realized after a moment, someone else entirely. Discussing logistics timelines like this was any ordinary company closing out its fiscal year. Barrett's mind raced through everything he thought he knew. A rival syndicate didn't operate like this. Rival syndicates didn't run scheduled freight lines with public-facing logos and legitimate operational ledgers. What he was watching didn't look like a criminal operation at all, and that unsettled him more than if he'd found exactly what he expected. He needed proof, something to bring back to Marcus and the others before they jumped to conclusions that could get someone hurt. Barrett edged along the container toward a gap where he could see through a side window of the trailer. Evelyn stood over a table covered in shipping manifests, and beside her, a large monitor displayed a company organizational chart. At the very top, above every regional office, above every name Barrett didn't recognize, sat a single title: Founder and Principal, V. Mercer. Barrett stared at the screen until his eyes burned, the fog and cold forgotten. There it was, in plain type, no code names, no hidden meaning. His wife wasn't a name buried in the filings. She was the architect, standing at the top of the entire structure. And Evelyn Thorne, the woman he'd assumed was the reason his marriage had unraveled, was working for her. A sound behind him made his pulse spike, boots against gravel, closer than they should have been. Barrett pressed further into the shadow between containers just as 2 security guards passed within a few feet of him, radios crackling with routine check-in chatter, oblivious to his presence. He held his breath until they turned the corner and disappeared toward the far end of the yard. When he looked back through the window, Evelyn had moved to a different screen, this one showing a live map with a small blinking marker over a location Barrett didn't immediately recognize, somewhere northeast of the city. Beside the marker, a single label read, Principal, Active. His wife wasn't hiding in some quiet safe house, waiting for the panic to end. She was moving, actively, running something that stretched across 5 states, and the woman standing 3 feet away from him right now had been at her side for years, not as a threat to his marriage, but as the person Vivian had trusted to help her build all of it. Barrett backed away from the trailer slowly, retracing his path through the gap in the fence, his mind no longer chasing anger. It was chasing something closer to disbelief, laced with a grudging, uncomfortable respect he didn't want to feel yet. He'd spent 2 days assuming his wife had run from something, standing in the fog outside that rail yard, watching trucks stamped with her name roll out into the night. Barrett finally understood. She hadn't run from anything. She'd built something enormous, and for the first time in his life, Barrett Calloway had absolutely no idea how to catch up to her. The company registration Dorian pulled overnight led straight to a glass tower in downtown Minneapolis, 40 floors of steel and light, with Mercer Logistics stamped in brushed silver letters across the lobby directory. Barrett arrived alone again, dressed in a plain gray suit instead of anything that might announce who he was, though he suspected by now that wouldn't matter. If Vivian had built all of this without him noticing, she almost certainly knew he was coming before he'd even boarded the elevator. The lobby didn't look like anything he'd expected. No armed men at the doors, no hushed tension in the air. Just a clean, modern space filled with employees carrying coffee cups and folders, moving between meetings like it was any other Tuesday. A receptionist greeted him with a polite smile that gave away nothing, and Barrett found himself, for the first time in years, unsure of how to walk into a room. He didn't have to figure it out. The elevator doors opened before he reached them, and Evelyn Thorne stepped out to meet him, dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer, her expression calm and entirely unsurprised. "You found us faster than I expected," she said. "I told her you would." Barrett studied her carefully, the woman he'd spent 3 months believing was tearing his marriage apart. Up close, there was nothing about her that matched the story he'd built in his head. "You're not with Detroit?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I've never been with Detroit," Evelyn said. That rumor was useful, so nobody bothered correcting it. It kept people asking the wrong questions. She gestured toward the elevator. "Walk with me. She wanted me to explain a few things before you saw her." They rode up in silence, and when the doors opened onto the top floor, Barrett found himself standing in an office that looked nothing like a criminal front. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the frozen Mississippi, glass-walled meeting rooms buzzed with quiet activity, and a wall near the entrance displayed framed route maps stretching across 5 states, each one marked with steady, careful growth over 3 years. "3 years ago," Evelyn said, leading him past the maps, "your wife came to me with a plan, not a fantasy, a full financial model, built from routes she'd studied for over a year, routes she believed your syndicate was going to lose eventually, whether through market pressure or rival encroachment. She wasn't wrong. You lost the Midwest freight contracts 18 months later, almost exactly the way she predicted." Barrett's jaw tightened. "She could have told me, warned me." "Would you have listened?" Evelyn asked, not unkindly. "A woman telling you your trade routes were structurally unsound, based on spreadsheets she built herself, with no formal business background. Be honest with yourself, Mr. Calloway." He didn't answer, because he already knew what his answer would have been 18 months ago, and it wasn't a flattering one. "So she didn't ask," Evelyn continued. "She built, quietly, legally, one acquisition at a time, using capital that would have otherwise been lost anyway. I came on as her operating partner because I'd spent a decade in commercial logistics, and I recognized what she was building before most people in this industry would have. It wasn't about hiding from you. It was about surviving without you, in case survival ever became necessary." "And was it?" Barrett asked. "Necessary?" Evelyn's expression shifted, something careful crossing her face. "That's not my story to tell." She led him toward a corner office, its door closed, blinds drawn. "She's not here right now, but she left something for you to see first." Inside, a single folder sat on the desk, far thinner than the one Price had handed him in Milwaukee. Barrett opened it and found a simple financial summary, a snapshot of Mercer Logistics' current standing. Full ownership of freight contracts across 5 states, exclusive rail access agreements that no other company in the region held. Total valuation that made his own legitimate holdings look modest by comparison. At the bottom of the page, a single handwritten line, unmistakably Vivian's handwriting. "You never asked what I did with my time. I'm done waiting to be asked." Barrett read it twice, feeling something complicated settle in his chest, equal parts sting and reluctant admiration. He looked up at Evelyn. "Where is she?" "Somewhere safe," Evelyn said. "She's not hiding from danger, if that's what you're worried about. She's giving herself space to see what you do next, now that you know." "And what am I supposed to do?" Evelyn studied him for a long moment before answering. "That depends entirely on what you actually want, Mr. Calloway. If you came here to reclaim something you think belongs to you, you'll lose. She's structured every part of this to be untouchable, legally and financially. There's no angle where you take this from her." She paused. "But if you came here because you genuinely want to understand who your wife has become, I think that's a conversation worth having. She does too, or she wouldn't have told me to let you find us at all." Barrett looked out at the wall of route maps again, at 3 years of careful, patient work laid out in neat lines across 5 states, built entirely without him, built in the very hours he'd assumed were stealing his wife away for someone else. He thought about the ring on his desk back in Chicago, about 90 seconds of dead camera footage, about every small clue he'd dismissed because it never occurred to him that Vivian might be capable of something this vast. "Tell me where she is," Barrett said quietly. "Not to stop her, to talk to her." Evelyn studied him a moment longer, as if weighing whether he meant it, then finally nodded. "Lake Geneva," she said. "She's expecting you might come. Whether she's ready to see you is a different question entirely." The property sat at the end of a narrow private road, half hidden behind bare trees, a stone house facing a lake that had frozen solid at its edges. Barrett had driven through the night to get there, and by the time he pulled up the gravel drive, the sky had only just begun to lighten to grey. No guards stood at the gate, no cameras tracked his approach. It struck him, walking up to the front door, that Vivienne hadn't needed protection here. She'd needed distance, and distance didn't require armed men. She opened the door before he knocked, as if she'd been standing there watching the drive for hours. She wore a plain wool sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back, none of the polish she usually carried into a room. For a moment, neither of them said anything, the cold morning air moving between them. "You found us faster than Evelyn thought you would," Vivian finally said. "I had help I didn't know I needed," Barrett replied. "Turns out my wife built an empire I never noticed." She stepped back from the door, silently inviting him in, and he followed her into a living room with a fire already burning low in the hearth. She didn't offer him a drink. She didn't sit across from him like this was a negotiation. She simply stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the lake. "Why?" Barrett said, the single word carrying 3 days of exhaustion and disbelief. "Why all of it? The shell companies, the real estate, the freight contracts? 3 years, Vivian, 3 years of building something this size right under my roof, and I never saw a single piece of it." "Because you weren't supposed to," she said, "not out of spite, out of necessity." She turned to face him. "Do you remember 2.5 years ago, when you told the board the Midwest freight losses were bad luck, bad timing, a shifting market, nothing anyone could have prevented?" "I remember." "I told you 6 months before that it was going to happen," Vivian said, quietly, over dinner, the way I told you things back then. "I said your roots were too concentrated, too dependent on 3 aging rail partnerships that were already renegotiating terms behind your back. You told me I was worrying over nothing. You told me to let the men who understood logistics handle logistics." Barrett's stomach tightened at the memory, vague until now, resurfacing with sharper edges. He had said exactly that. He remembered the conversation and remembered dismissing it within minutes, distracted by something else entirely. "You were right," he said quietly. "I know I was right," Vivian said, no triumph in her voice, only tired certainty. "So I stopped waiting for you to listen. I started diverting what I could, quietly, legally, before the roots collapsed completely. Every dollar that would have disappeared into a bad market instead went into buying the infrastructure that market depended on. Warehouses, rail access, distribution hubs. I didn't take anything from you, Barrett. I saved what you were about to lose and turned it into something you couldn't lose again. By hiding it from me. By protecting it from you," Vivian said, sharper now. "If I'd told you what I was building, you would have folded it into your operation within a year. You would have put your name on the contracts, your people in the offices, your instincts running a business that required patience and structure instead of force. I've watched you build things for 8 years, Barrett. You're brilliant at expansion. You're terrible at protection. I needed something that couldn't be taken, blackmailed, or burned down by a rival with a grudge. I needed something entirely separate from everything you touch." Barrett sat down slowly, the weight of the last 3 days finally catching up to him. "So the late nights, the meetings you wouldn't explain." "Building this," Vivian said, "every single time. There was never anyone else, Barrett. There was only ever this." He looked up at her, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, the anger that had carried him across 4 states began to shift into something quieter, more complicated. You could have told me eventually, once it was strong enough, once you knew it couldn't be touched. I was going to, Vivian said, her voice softening slightly. I had a timeline. Another year, maybe less, once the St. Louis contracts closed and the network was fully self-sustaining. But you handed me an ultimatum on Christmas Eve without even realizing it. You told me to go be with someone who wasn't you, so I did exactly that. I went to be with the only thing in my life that's ever fully belonged to me. The fire cracked softly in the silence that followed. Barrett stared into it, turning over 3 years of conversations he now understood differently. Small comments he'd waved away as nothing. Moments he'd been too distracted to notice were carrying far more weight than he'd given them credit for. I underestimated you, he said finally. For years. I don't know how to fix that in one conversation. You don't fix it in one conversation, Vivian said. You fix it by showing up differently from now on, assuming there's a now on you actually want. Barrett stood and crossed the room to stand beside her at the window, the frozen lake stretching out grey and still in the early light. There's a syndicate summit in 2 days. Every regional boss will be there, dealing with supply chain problems nobody can explain yet. Something flickered across Vivian's face, quick and unreadable. I know, she said. I'm the reason they can't explain it. Barrett turned to look at her fully, the pieces of the last 3 days rearranging themselves once again into a shape far larger than he'd been prepared for. What did you do? He asked slowly. Vivian allowed herself, for the first time in days, the faintest trace of a smile. You'll see tomorrow night. Everyone will. The summit had been called on short notice, which in Barrett's experience meant only one thing. Something had gone badly wrong for enough people that pride no longer mattered. He arrived at the conference center just after dusk, a converted warehouse on neutral ground where regional bosses gathered only when a problem threatened all of them at once. Tonight, the parking lot was full of black cars, and the tension inside the building was thick enough to taste before he'd even crossed the threshold. Marcus met him near the entrance, his face tight with the kind of frustration that came from too many unanswered questions. Every major freight corridor across 5 states locked up in the last 72 hours, he said, keeping his voice low as they walked. Nobody can move product through the Midwest without going through a private rail network that didn't exist 18 months ago. Everyone in that room is assuming it's a hostile takeover. Half of them think it's you. It's not me, Barrett said. I know that now, Marcus said, but you're about to be the only person in that room who does. They stepped into the main hall, a long room filled with round tables, each seating a different regional boss and his closest advisors. Barrett recognized most of the faces, men he'd negotiated with, competed against, occasionally allied with over the years, all of them now wearing the same expression of controlled alarm. At the head of the room stood a temporary stage, empty, waiting for whoever had called the meeting to explain what was happening. Barrett took his seat at his usual table, Marcus beside him, and watched as the lights dimmed slightly and a single figure walked out onto the stage. Vivian. She wore a sharp black suit, nothing like the wool sweater from that morning at the lake, her hair pulled back, her posture entirely different from the woman who'd stood at the window watching frozen water. This wasn't his wife standing in a living room explaining herself. This was someone else entirely, someone the room hadn't been prepared to see. A ripple of confusion moved through the tables. Barrett heard someone 2 seats away mutter, "Isn't that Calloway's wife?" "Good evening," Vivian said, her voice carrying easily across the room without need of a microphone. "My name is Vivian Mercer. Some of you have spent the last 3 days trying to determine who controls the private rail lines currently affecting every supply corridor in this region. I'm here to save you the trouble of guessing." The room went utterly silent. 18 months ago, several of you lost freight contracts you assumed had simply dried up, Vivian continued, stepping to the edge of the stage. Market shifts, unreliable partners, bad timing. That's the story most of you were told, and most of you believed it because it was easier than the alternative. She let that sit for a moment. The alternative is that I acquired those contracts legally through Mercer Logistics over the course of 3 years, while every one of you was focused on watching each other for signs of weakness. A boss near the front, a heavy-set man named Reeves, who ran territory across Ohio, half rose from his seat. This is a joke. A woman doesn't build a rail network without backing. Whose money is this really? Mine, Vivian said simply. Every dollar. I'd be happy to walk you through the filings personally, Mr. Reeves, though I suspect your lawyers will find them considerably more thorough than anything your own operation has on record. A few quiet laughs moved through the room, quickly stifled. Barrett watched, frozen between pride and disbelief, as his wife stood alone on that stage and held a room full of dangerous men entirely in the palm of her hand. Here is the situation you actually need to understand, Vivian continued. Mercer Logistics now controls the primary freight and rail access across 5 states. Not through force, not through threats. Through contracts, ownership, and infrastructure that took 3 years to build and cannot be undone by a hostile move against me, because there is no single point of failure to attack. No warehouse you burn, no truck you seize, no man you threaten will change who holds these contracts. She let the words settle before continuing. So the question in this room isn't who controls the supply chain anymore. That question is already answered. The question is whether you'd like to keep operating through me as a business partner, on fair terms, negotiated individually with each of you, or whether you'd prefer to spend the next several months trying to build an alternative network from nothing, while your competitors sign with me instead and leave you behind. Reeves sat back down slowly, his earlier bravado gone. Around the room, Barrett watched the calculations happening in real time. Men who'd spent decades building reputations on fear, now realizing that fear meant nothing against a structure they couldn't threaten, couldn't buy, and couldn't outmaneuver. Marcus leaned toward Barrett, his voice barely a whisper. Did you know about any of this? Some of it, Barrett admitted. Not all of it. Not until tonight. He watched Vivian field a dozen sharp, hostile questions from bosses twice her age, each one met with calm, precise answers backed by figures she clearly knew without needing notes. She wasn't defending herself. She was negotiating from a position none of them could challenge, and doing it with a composure Barrett had never once seen her use inside their own home. By the time she stepped off the stage, the room had shifted entirely. The hostility hadn't vanished, but it had transformed into something closer to reluctant respect. The same uneasy recognition men gave each other when someone had simply outplayed them fair and square. Vivian walked straight past Barrett's table without stopping, her eyes meeting his for only a brief second. There was no apology in that look, no softness, just a quiet, unmistakable message. This is who I am now. Decide what you're going to do with that. Barrett sat in his chair long after she'd left the building, the room around him still buzzing with stunned conversation, and understood finally that whatever marriage he thought he'd been living for 8 years, it had never once contained the whole truth of the woman he married. The call came in just after noon, Marcus's voice tight with urgency through the phone. Reeves and 2 other bosses just moved on a Mercer Logistics cargo operation outside St. Louis. Private airfield, 3 of her planes grounded on the tarmac. They're not being subtle about it. Barrett was already moving before Marcus finished the sentence, calling for his convoy, his mind working through the implications faster than his feet could carry him to the car. Reeves had sat quietly through Vivian's presentation 2 nights ago, humiliated in front of every regional boss in that room, and men like Reeves didn't absorb humiliation without eventually looking for a way to even the ledger. A hostile move against her planes wasn't about business, it was about pride, dressed up as leverage. He reached Dorian on the drive. Get me everything on that airfield. Who's actually there? How many men? What kind of hardware? Pulling it now, Dorian said. Sir, this doesn't look organized. It looks like Reeves put something together fast, probably in the last 24 hours. He's got maybe 15 men on site, mostly muscle, not tacticians. It reads like a pressure play, not a real assault. That confirmed what Barrett already suspected. Reeves wasn't trying to seize the planes outright. He was trying to force a negotiation on his own terms, using intimidation to claw back some of the leverage he'd lost on that stage in Indianapolis. It was a desperate move, but desperate men still made dangerous mistakes, and Barrett had no intention of finding out what those mistakes might cost. The airfield came into view an hour later, a stretch of flat tarmac ringed by chain-link fence, 3 cargo planes sitting motionless near the hangar with the Mercer Logistics compass rose painted across their tails. A cluster of black SUVs blocked the runway access. Reeves's men fanned out near the aircraft, clearly positioning themselves to prevent any departure rather than to storm the planes directly. Barrett's convoy pulled up along the access road, and he stepped out first, scanning the scene. Evelyn Thorne stood near the hangar entrance, arms crossed, flanked by a handful of Mercer security who looked calm but alert, outnumbered but not panicked. She spotted Barrett immediately and crossed the distance between them. "This isn't your fight," she said, though there was no real conviction behind it, more caution than refusal. "It became my fight the moment someone tried to strong-arm my wife's company," Barrett said. "Where is she?" "On her way, 20 minutes out." Evelyn's jaw tightened. Reeves is testing whether the network holds without her standing on a stage to defend it in person. Barrett looked past her at the standoff on the tarmac, at Reeves himself stepping out from behind one of the SUVs, flanked by 2 men, his expression carrying the particular confidence of someone who believed he'd finally found the crack in an otherwise flawless structure. "Calloway," Reeves called out, loud enough to carry across the open space. "Didn't expect you to come defend your wife's little empire personally. Careful. People might start thinking you're the one taking orders in that marriage." A few of Barrett's men shifted, ready for a signal that didn't come. Barrett walked forward instead, alone, hands visible, stopping a measured distance from Reeves. "You grounded 3 cargo planes belonging to a company that isn't mine," Barrett said evenly. "Which means this isn't a dispute between you and me. It's a dispute between you and Mercer Logistics. And last I checked, you already lost that conversation 2 nights ago. That every syndicate at that summit signed with her, because the alternative is exactly what you're doing right now, standing on a runway, making threats that accomplish nothing except proving you can't compete without resorting to force. If you damage those planes, you don't just lose access to her network. Every boss who signed with her watches how she responds, and every one of them will know you're the reason their supply chains just got more expensive and more difficult. You won't be feared, Reeves. You'll be avoided, which in this business is far worse." Reeves's men glanced toward each other, uncertainty creeping into a plan that had clearly been built on momentum rather than patience. "And where exactly do you fit into this?" Reeves demanded. "You're not on her payroll." "No," Barrett said, "but my convoy is standing between your men and those planes right now, and it's going to stay there until my wife arrives to handle this the way she chooses. You want to test whether her network holds without a stage and a microphone. Fine. Test it. Just understand you're testing it against my people too, and we don't negotiate the way she does." The standoff stretched for another quiet, tense minute before Reeves finally stepped back, muttering something to his men that sent them retreating toward the SUVs. It wasn't a surrender, not entirely, but it was a retreat, and by the time Vivian's car pulled onto the tarmac 15 minutes later, the runway had already cleared. She stepped out, taking in the scene, Barrett's convoy still positioned protectively near her planes, Evelyn briefing her quickly under her breath. Vivian's eyes found Barrett across the tarmac, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, something in her expression shifted into quiet, genuine surprise. He hadn't come to reclaim anything. He'd come to protect what was entirely hers, without asking for a single thing in return. Vivian's Chicago headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a tower she'd purchased 18 months earlier through a holding company Barrett had never once questioned, assuming it belonged to some anonymous investment group rather than his own wife. Walking into the executive boardroom now, seeing her name etched quietly into the glass at the entrance, he felt the strange vertigo of standing inside a life that had existed parallel to his own for years without him noticing. Vivian sat at the head of the long table, a single folder in front of her, Evelyn seated to her right with a laptop open, ready to pull up figures the moment they were needed. Barrett took the seat across from her, alone, no lieutenants, no advisors. This wasn't a negotiation he wanted anyone else managing on his behalf. "After yesterday," Vivian said, sliding the folder across the table, "I think we're past the point of pretending this is still a personal matter only. What happened at that airfield proved something neither of us can ignore. My network is strong enough, but it's not invulnerable to every kind of pressure, and your syndicate depends on freight movement I now control." Barrett opened the folder. Inside was a clean, formal contract, the language precise, nothing hidden in footnotes or buried in dense legal phrasing designed to obscure its meaning. "Mercer Logistics handles all distribution for my territory," he read aloud. "Full service agreement, exclusive terms." He looked up. "This isn't a partnership. This is you owning the pipeline my entire operation runs through." "It's a partnership," Vivian said evenly, "but not the kind you're used to. I'm not folding into your syndicate, Barrett. I'm not becoming another department you oversee. Mercer Logistics remains entirely independent, with its own leadership, its own board, its own decisions. You get guaranteed access, priority routing, and protection under a company that just proved it can't be pressured by force. In exchange, you provide security backing for our physical assets, the way you did yesterday, formalized instead of improvised." Barrett read through the terms slowly, aware of Evelyn watching him closely from across the table, gauging his reaction the way she'd clearly been trained to read rooms full of powerful, wounded egos. "You want equal footing," Barrett said finally, "not just in this deal, in everything." "I want what I've already built to be recognized for what it is," Vivian said, "not absorbed, not diminished into a footnote about my husband's business. I spent 3 years making sure nobody could take this from me, including you. This contract isn't me asking your permission to keep it. It's me offering you a seat at a table I already own." The words landed harder than she probably intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as she'd intended all along. Barrett set the folder down and looked at her directly, searching for some trace of the woman who'd stood at that lake house window 3 days ago, quietly explaining herself. He found her there, underneath the sharper edges the last week had carved into her, but the softness hadn't disappeared. It had simply learned to stand beside something harder. "There's a clause here about autonomy in decision-making," Barrett said. "No syndicate approval required for expansion, partnerships, or new contracts, even ones that might compete with syndicate interests." "Correct," Vivian said, "because the moment I need your approval to grow, I stop being independent and start being an asset you manage. That's not a partnership. That's ownership with better manners." Evelyn spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "Mr. Calloway, I want to be direct with you because I think it matters. In 3 years of working alongside your wife, I have never seen her make a decision out of anger or spite. Every acquisition, every contract, every structural choice in this company was built for one reason: to make sure she never had to depend on anyone else's protection to survive. That's not an attack on you. It's simply who she's become, and frankly, who she probably needed to become." Barrett absorbed that in silence, turning the folder over in his hands, thinking about 8 years of marriage built on assumptions he'd never bothered questioning. He'd assumed protection flowed only one direction in their relationship. He'd assumed strength looked like the version of it he practiced every day, forceful and visible. Watching Vivian now, calm and immovable across the table, he understood that her version of strength had simply been quieter and far more patient than his own. "I'll sign it," Barrett said. "Not because I don't have a choice, because I don't want a choice that looks any different than this one." Something eased slightly in Vivian's posture, though her expression remained careful, controlled. "There's one more condition," she said, "not written into the contract." "Name it." "No more assumptions," she said, "about where I am, what I'm doing, who I'm with. If you have a question about my life, you ask me directly, and I'll answer directly. That's the only way this works, in business or otherwise. Barrett nodded slowly. Same applies to you. If you think I'm hiding something, ask. Don't build 3 years of evidence before you say a single word to me about it. A faint, almost reluctant smile crossed Vivian's face. That's fair. He signed the contract there at the table, his signature settling beneath hers, 2 names now formally bound together across a structure neither of them had expected to exist a week earlier. Evelyn gathered the paperwork efficiently, already moving toward the next item on whatever list ran constantly through her mind. But Vivian stayed seated, watching Barrett as he set the pen down. You surprised me yesterday, she said quietly, once Evelyn had stepped out. At the airfield. You didn't come to take anything back. You came to protect what was already mine. I'm still figuring out what that means for us, Barrett admitted. But I know it means something. Vivian studied him a moment longer, something unguarded flickering behind her eyes for the first time all morning. Then maybe we figure the rest of it out somewhere that isn't a boardroom. The place Vivian chose wasn't anywhere Barrett expected. No restaurant, no quiet corner of the estate they'd shared for 8 years. Instead, she gave him an address just north of the city, a small hill overlooking Lake Michigan where the wind came in hard and cold off the water, the lights of Chicago glittering faintly in the distance behind them. We used to come here, Vivian said, when he found her standing near the railing, her coat pulled tight against the wind. Before the estate, before any of this, do you remember? Barrett looked out at the dark water, the memory surfacing slowly. Our 2nd year together. You said you liked how far away the city looked from up here, like it couldn't reach you. I still like that about it, she said. Some things haven't changed. He came to stand beside her at the railing, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her despite the cold, far enough to give her the space she'd clearly wanted when she picked this spot instead of anywhere more private. For a while, neither of them spoke, the wind filling the silence between them the way it had filled so many silences over the last week. I've been thinking about something you said at the lake house, Barrett finally said. That I'm good at building and terrible at protecting. I've turned that over every day since, trying to figure out if it was fair. Was it? Yes, he admitted, the word costing him more than he expected. I built my entire operation around expansion. More territory, more contracts, more reach. I never thought hard enough about what happens to the people standing closest to me while I'm busy expanding outward. You included. Vivian kept her eyes on the water. I didn't build Mercer Logistics because I stopped loving you, Barrett. I built it because I realized somewhere along the way that loving you wasn't the same as being safe with you. Those felt like 2 separate things, and I didn't know how to have both. The honesty in that landed harder than anything Reeves or the summit or the last week of chasing her across 4 states had managed to land. Barrett turned to look at her fully. I never wanted you to feel unsafe. I know that doesn't erase 8 years of you feeling exactly that. No, she said quietly. It doesn't. But it matters that you're saying it now, without me having to drag it out of you across another folder of evidence. He allowed himself a tired, small laugh. I'm never going to underestimate a folder again. That earned him the first real smile he'd seen from her all week, brief but genuine, cracking through the careful composure she'd worn since that stage in Indianapolis. It faded quickly, replaced by something more serious. I need you to understand something, Vivian said. I don't regret building this. Even if none of the rest of this had happened, even if you'd never found out, I would still have built it, because I needed to know I could survive on my own terms. That's not going to change now that we've signed a contract and made peace over a boardroom table. I don't want it to change, Barrett said, and meant it more than he expected to. I spent years assuming my strength was the only kind that mattered in this marriage. Watching you stand on that stage, watching you hold a room full of men twice your age without raising your voice once, I understood how wrong I'd been. I don't want a version of you that needs less than everything you've built. I want to be someone you don't have to build all of it in secret to protect yourself from. Vivian studied him for a long moment, the wind pulling strands of hair loose from where she'd tucked them back. "That's going to take longer than one conversation on a hill." "I know," Barrett said. "I'm not asking for it to be fixed tonight. I'm asking for permission to try." She was quiet for a while, looking out at the water, the city lights shimmering faintly behind the dark shape of the lake. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its careful edge, softer than he'd heard it since before Christmas Eve. "I built this empire to make sure I never had to depend on you to survive," she said. "But surviving alone was never actually what I wanted, Barrett. I just needed to know I could, before I let myself need anyone again." She turned to face him fully. "I'm not walking away from what I built. Not for you, not for anyone. But I'm willing to build whatever comes next together, as long as it's actually together this time. No more separate lives running quietly under the same roof." "Together," Barrett repeated, testing the weight of the word. "Not as your protection, not as the man managing your empire from the sidelines." "No," Vivian said, "as my equal, or this doesn't work at all." Barrett looked out at the water, at the city he'd spent 8 years building his own kind of empire within, and understood, standing on that hill, that everything he thought he knew about strength and partnership had needed to be dismantled before he could actually see the woman standing beside him clearly. "Equal," he said. "I can live with that. I think, for the first time in a long time, I actually want to." The wind picked up again, sharp and cold, and neither of them moved to leave. They stood together at the railing, the distant lights of Chicago glittering below them. Two people who had spent a week tearing down every assumption they'd built their marriage on, finally standing on solid ground they'd both chosen instead of inherited. 1 week to the hour since Vivian had set her ring on his desk and walked out into the dark, Barrett stood in the same tower where Mercer Logistics kept its top-floor offices, watching the sun come up over a city that had no idea how much had shifted beneath its surface in 7 short days. The boardroom had been rearranged overnight. 2 long tables pushed together to form one, chairs from both companies mixed rather than separated by side. Small detail. Vivian's idea, not his, though Barrett had come to notice that most of the details that mattered lately had been. Marcus arrived first, followed by the rest of Barrett's lieutenants, filing in with the cautious energy of men still adjusting to a new arrangement they hadn't fully processed yet. Evelyn came next, trailing a small team from Mercer's legal department, binders in hand, the same brisk efficiency Barrett had watched her carry through a rail yard in Gary a week earlier. And then Vivian walked in, dressed the way she'd dressed in Indianapolis, sharp and composed, though something in her expression this morning carried less armor than it had on that stage. "Let's get this finished," she said, taking her seat at the head of the joined table, directly across from Barrett rather than beside him, a small but deliberate choice that told the room exactly what kind of arrangement this was going to be. The final documents were already prepared, reviewed overnight by lawyers from both sides, every clause negotiated down to language neither party could quietly exploit later. Barrett had read it twice more before arriving, and this time, unlike the version he'd signed 2 days earlier, this one bound their operations together formally, publicly, permanently. Mercer Logistics folded into the joint structure not as a subsidiary, but as an equal governing partner, its board seats protected, its independence written into the founding charter itself. Barrett's syndicate, in turn, gained guaranteed access to every route across 5 states, backed by security infrastructure his own men would now help maintain, rather than merely defend when threatened. "Before we sign," Vivienne said, addressing the room rather than just Barrett, "I want to be clear about what this actually is, because I know some of you are still trying to figure out the shape of it. This isn't Mercer Logistics being absorbed into Callaway operations. It isn't a wife rejoining her husband's business under a different name. This is 2 structures, built separately, choosing to move forward as one, with equal ownership and equal say in every decision that follows." A few of Barrett's older lieutenants exchanged glances, the kind of look men gave each other when tradition quietly rearranged itself in front of them, and there was nothing left to do but adjust. Marcus, to his credit, simply nodded, the same steady acceptance he'd shown Barrett through every strange turn of the past week. Barrett stood and reached for the pen first this time, signing his name at the base of the final page before sliding it across the table. Vivian signed beneath it without hesitation, her signature settling next to his the way it had 2 days earlier, in a smaller, quieter version of this same room. Except this time, the paperwork carried the full weight of everyone watching, everyone finally understanding. Evelyn collected the signed documents, already moving toward the next set of logistics that would need handling by afternoon, the practical momentum of running something this large, never fully pausing even for a moment like this one. Around the table, the two teams began quietly introducing themselves properly for the first time, exchanging names and titles, the early, careful beginnings of two organizations learning to function as one. Barrett walked around the table to where Vivian stood, watching the room settle into its new shape. "Feels different than I expected," he said, "signing something this big and not feeling like I lost anything." "That's the part most people never understand about real partnerships," Vivian said. "They're not about one side giving something up so the other side can win. They're about both sides ending up with more than either of them had standing alone." "I spent 8 years thinking I already understood that," Barrett admitted. "Turns out I only understood my half of it." Vivian allowed herself a small, tired smile, the kind that came only after a week this long finally reached its end. "You're a fast learner for someone who missed 3 years of evidence sitting in his own house." "I'm not planning on missing anything again," Barrett said. "You made sure of that." They stood together near the window as the room behind them settled into its new rhythm, lieutenants and executives comparing notes, Evelyn already fielding a call about a shipment delay in St. Louis. The ordinary noise of two large operations learning to breathe as one. Outside, the city stretched out under a clear winter sky, the same skyline Barrett had stared at from a command center exactly a week earlier, certain his life was unraveling, with no idea it was actually about to be rebuilt into something sturdier than anything he'd constructed on his own. Vivian reached into her coat pocket and pulled something small into her palm, holding it out to him without a word. Her wedding ring, the same one she'd left on his desk 7 nights ago, though something about it looked different in her hand now. Less like a symbol he'd taken for granted, and more like something she was choosing to wear again on entirely new terms. Barrett took it gently, turning it once between his fingers before slipping it back onto her hand himself, the two of them standing quietly in the doorway of an empire that belonged to neither of them alone anymore. "Welcome back," he said quietly. "I never really left," Vivian said. "I was just finally showing you where I'd been the whole time." Behind them, the restructured company moved forward into its first full day, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Barrett Calloway and Vivian Mercer stood at the head of something they had built not as protector and protected, but as two equal architects of the same enterprise, ruling side by side, exactly as she'd always intended.